Gord Dwanu in The Secret Path wrote the lyrics.
I am the stranger. You can't see me. I am the stranger. Do you know what I mean?
In describing the plight of Channing Winjack and his experiences in being a victim of Canada's residential school. In 1828, the first residential school was opened where Indigenous children were taken from their families to attend the school. They were forbidden to speak their languages, wear traditional clothing, and practice their rituals. The mistreatments were continued until 1996 with the closing of the last residential school. The ramifications of the cultural genocide of Indigenous children have left long-lasting physical and psychological scars that needed to be addressed for healing and identity to be established. Today, many Indigenous children are apprehended from their biological families by the CFS Children and Family Service and are adopted by white foster parents. Without a strongly developed Indigenous identity, the children fall into the state of identity crisis at a young age and experience severe mental and physical illnesses. Studies show that Indigenous adolescents suffer from depression and suicidal thoughts at a rate of 126% for male and 35% for female in comparison with 24% and 5% of non-Indigenous youth. What's more, according to a new study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, the Indigenous adolescents are 30 times more likely to die from substance abuse than the non-Aboriginals. In addition, the Aboriginal children have a higher tendency to suffer from health issues such as diabetes, obesity, and malnutrition. The higher and startling statistics have been directly attributed to the children's environment and upbringing, which do not foster their cultural identity. Professor Jane Marcia, a clinical and developmental psychologist, has developed a theory dealing with identity status achieved during teenage time. His theory classified identity formation into 4 stages: identity diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. Teenagers in different stages display different levels of commitment and exploration toward identity formation. Adolescents, especially at stage 2, where they demonstrated a high degree of commitment and a low degree of exploration, will establish their identity by absorbing the beliefs and values in their native community and family. However, it's evident that the Indigenous youth lack the connection between their culture and community and cannot easily pursue the path of developing a healthy identity. Zach, who was a former CFS child and was adopted when he was 5, claimed that
I don't talk at all to my dad. My mom, I haven't talked to for maybe a couple years.
Without any resonation with Indigenous culture, a multitude of problems cannot be easily solved without the necessary support system from the onset of birth. Legislatively, the Canadian government has wrongfully determined the identities of the Indigenous. The government has classified the Indigenous people into 3 classifications in the Act: Inuit, Métis, and Indians. However, there are over 90 Indigenous languages and over 600 tribes that has been identified throughout Canada. Each of these tribes has its own language, tradition, and cultural practice, which constitute its identity as a whole. For the government to generally ignore this fact and to reduce the entire population into 3 classifications does not acknowledge each tribe's unique identity, as Dr. Val Napoleon explains.
The laws of Canada have primarily been exclusive. The main focus of them is to limit who can be Indian, at a loss, I think, of a much fuller, deeper, richer understanding of who we are as a people.
Canada's law really failed to provide justified rights for Indigenous people as they continuously suffered from the loss of identity. As can be seen, Canada neglected to recognize the Indigenous as part of Canada's cultural mosaic. The damage and assimilation cannot be fully reversed. But there are steps that can be instituted in moving forward. There are already some debates around changing the CFS legislations and give the Indigenous government control over the child service so they can be raised in their own culture. The government has also launched the Indigenous Service Canada's First Nation Child and Family Service Program that provided $1.1 million of fund in 2018 to 2019 to protect and support the Indigenous children living in reserves and reduce the number of children in care. These programs and initiatives will continue to help the Indigenous in gaining a sense of identity and pride and promote their well-being and progresses as contributing citizens of Canada.